A very well-known person, I think, for everyone. Former journalist at Russia Today, at the Russian propaganda TV channel, whose dramatic defection, whose dramatic refusal to carry on took a world by storm. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Miss Elizabeth Wall.
Hello, I am here to talk about Russian propaganda and how it operates. And as he just mentioned, I used to work for a Russian television station, so I know the ins and outs of how it operates. When I first resigned from the station, I was asked repeatedly, how does Russian propaganda work? And I found it difficult to explain in clean, neat sound bites because Russian disinformation tactics can be so bizarre and so confusing, and that's by design. But taking a step back, I realized that there were some recurring themes and tactics used in the newsroom over and over again and could be applied to stories across the board. And I've identified them as the 3Ds. Okay, and they are to deny, deflect, and distort. I'm going to go over each one kind of broadly and then go into some specific examples in a bit. So to deny, that's a really common tactic, and I think that one is the most self-explanatory. Essentially, it's saying it didn't happen. So denial takes the form of ignoring facts or details of a story that doesn't fit the Russian agenda. There's also this tendency to say that there's no proof, there's no definitive proof. So if you can't prove it, that's kind of the end of the conversation. We got to move on. And then there's this tendency to cherry pick details that only fits into the Russian agenda. So this kind of censors information that's embarrassing to the Kremlin. Another tactic is to deflect, and the dictionary definition of that is to cause something to change direction. So in Russian media, essentially, you change the topic. And those that study Russian media have come up with a very fitting term for this called whataboutism. And so if there's a story involving Russia that's kind of embarrassing, the conversation will shift to, well, what about Iraq? What about Libya? What about any kind of random Western failing at some point in history? So it kind of shifts the conversation to Western hypocrisy and shuts the conversation down, whatever the matter is at hand. And another way to deflect is to blame the mainstream media. And routinely, reporters were actually tasked with reporting on stories to bash the mainstream media as being part of this greater conspiracy working with Western governments and Western institutions to kind of make the Western world, to put them in this dominant position and basically to hold Russia down. And lastly, another element of Russian disinformation is distortion. And a story can be distorted both through denying and through deflection. But also, one common tactic that I observed is this putting out alternative theories. And we saw it with MH17. As soon as it happened, a lot of competing theories were put forth. The first one was that the Ukrainians were actually aiming for a jet that Russian President Vladimir Putin was flying on. There was some other bizarre conspiracy theories that it was actually the first Malaysian airliner that was already carrying dead bodies. That's one of the more far-fetched ones. But one of the one that kind of stuck is that it was the Ukrainians that were responsible for the downing of that jet. Another way to distort the conversation is through conspiracy theories. And on Russian media, a platform is given to those that espouse conspiracy theories. Some of them are more radical, like the 9/11 truthers that believe 9/11 was an inside job. But there's one kind of prevailing and more believable conspiracy theory, and that prevailing theory is that Western powers are conspiring to isolate and destroy Russia. And we'll see that over and over again. And then there's the use of social media. And Russian media has become very savvy at manipulating the information space on the internet and using social media to spread pro-Kremlin messages and Western hate. So through these tactics, an overarching narrative emerges, and that's that the West is evil, corrupt, hypocritical, and conspiring to isolate and cripple Russia. So it's more about casting suspicion and undermining Western governments and institutions and values rather than convincing anybody that Russia is some wonderful place. And while bias certainly existed from the beginning, I would say the crisis in Ukraine was a pivotal point for Russian media because that's when I saw it being used as a tactic of war. And I actually have a video compilation that exemplifies Russian media coverage, or RT's coverage specifically, of the conflict in Ukraine.
To protect ethnic Russians, Moscow is considering the possibility of sending troops to the region. What will it take to peacefully settle the crisis? Well,
Ukraine is torn apart by revolution. As Western politicians cheered on Ukraine's Maidan, radical nationalist groups claim power across the country. In Crimea, ethnic Russians are now asking for Moscow's protection. Where is Ukraine's legitimate government? What will it take to restore peace and unity? And what are the chances outside forces will have to step in?
Crimea is on the defensive. Many in this autonomous republic in southern Ukraine, populated mostly by ethnic Russians, fear what happened in Kiev could bury their quiet way of life. But if you want peace, prepare for war.
This is the Crimea. There are two roads connecting the peninsula to the mainland, here and here. This is one of them. Two roads that locals say could become two gateways for undesirable forces from the north. And this is why they're here.
They fear that Ukrainian fascists pose a major threat. The country's ultranationalist right sector group helped topple President Yanukovych.
All right, so we'll kind of go over some of the key elements to the Russian narrative on Ukraine there. When Russian soldiers, or the little green men, appeared, the line was at first to deny their existence. But eventually the reports started to emerge, and you couldn't deny that there were Russians on the ground there. So the story then shifted to say that the existing forces were volunteers while maintaining Ukraine constantly as the aggressor. And to this day, Russia still denies direct involvement. You also heard this, this narrative of this need to protect ethnic Russians, and that Russian speakers were at risk and Russian peacekeeping forces were necessary to save them. And so you see the use of these words, volunteers, self-defense forces. Of course, we know now that those are distortions, the use of those words are distortions of reality. Also pushed was that the ousting of Yanukovych was orchestrated by the West. Again, this appeals to that conspiracy theory that I mentioned earlier before, this belief that the CIA and the State Department and Western officials actually orchestrated the revolution, and that conspiracy to blame the West for what they call not a revolution, but a Western-backed coup. And one of the most effective lies that or distortions, however you want to frame it, that you saw there in that report is that the opposition consists mainly of fascists and neo-Nazis. Again, this is a distortion. We know that it was a popular uprising, and yes, there were neo-Nazis that existed as part of that opposition, but they were a small sample of the overall revolution. So another story where disinformation was in full force was the coverage of MH17. And this was a new low, I think, because 298 people had died. And while the evidence had pointed to the plane being shot down by a missile shot by Russian-backed separatists, Russia's response was to distort the story. And here, oh, it's a little bit backwards here. We're going to go back to those slides. Here are some of the headlines reporting from RT and Sputnik, which also follows the same narrative as RT. MH17 report, no clear answers means no smoking gun evidence. Again, there's that argument that there's no proof. The MH17, the tragic MH17 disaster holds lessons for aviation and Ukrainian authorities, but apparently, according to that headline, no lessons for Russia or the Russian-backed separatists. Further probe into the MH17 crash is useless because the investigation is biased. Again, the mainstream media, Western powers, everybody else in the world, they're biased. And then here, Russia rejects Dutch report on MH17, but agrees Ukraine should have closed airspace. And so, again, that's casting blame on Ukraine wherever possible. So, very quickly, the spotlight shifted from Ukraine to Syria. And many assume that the sudden incursion into Syria was a strategic move to shift attention away from the disaster in Ukraine to this new conflict. And if that was the goal, it certainly was effective because seemingly overnight, Ukraine was put on the back burner and the spotlight was on Russia's military buildup in Syria. And the distortion certainly continued on to the coverage of Syria. And want to play a video example of RT's coverage of Syria.
This volunteer tells us most of the Islamists in the mountains are foreigners, Chechens, Afghans predominantly, well versed in guerrilla mountain warfare.
Nusra, Islamic State, the Free Syrian Army, every day they have a new name. Whoever gives them the most money gives them a new name.
It's not over yet though. Islamists retreated to a village a mere kilometer away, and the fighting hasn't stopped.
The American media are working hard to tell their viewers how terrible Russian airstrikes in Syria are.
A new force brings horror to Aleppo's southern countryside. These rare amateur pictures of possibly Russian airstrikes.
Possibly, but without a confirmation, we get a picture of despair with the blame implicitly assigned to Russia.
You rarely hear somebody use the statement, this apparently is, this could be Russian or American or Syrian, this might be.
Everything Russia has done in Syria is wrong. That is the view of the US government, echoed by reporting in the US media. With this kind of coverage, it's a safe guess that whatever terrible things happen in Syria will be presented as Russia's fault.
Well, lots to discuss. I'm joined live right now by political and media advisor to the Syrian president, Bethana Shaban, for more on this big story today. Russia joining the fight against Islamic State. So let's talk this through. Now, Russia has finally joined the war against ISIL.
I really believe that the West should wake up and see what's happening on the ground. I feel that the Russians, all the Arab people feel, that the Russians understand what's going on in Syria, understand what's going on in the Arab world, and they are committed to international legitimacy and to respect of country sovereignty. And that's why I feel that the Russians are going to succeed where the West did not, or did not want to succeed probably, I'm not sure.
Okay, speaking to us from Damascus in Syria, that's political and media advisor to the Syrian president, Bethana Shaban. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll go over the Russian narrative on Syria there. When the local volunteer was interviewed, he grouped al-Nusra, ISIS, and the Free Syrian Army. They were all lumped into one category. So in other words, a terrorist is anyone against the Assad regime. So the implication there is that we know that the US has supported the Free Syrian Army. So the implication is that the West is funding terrorism. So instead of investigating the real effects and targets of Russian airstrikes, the reporter blamed the mainstream media for conspiring against Russia. And the whole point was to take this adversarial position toward the West. Didn't matter what the truth was. And in that last report there, before that breaking story that Russia was joining the fight against the Islamic State, Russian media was criticizing the mainstream media for reporting on a Russian military buildup. Evidence was mounting that Russia was building up their military in Syria. And just a few days later, that turned out to be true. And the story morphed into being about Russia at the forefront of fighting terrorism. And if you checked out the front pages of RT and Sputnik, what you saw was a blitz of Russia coming in, swooping in, and as this hero fighting ISIS. But the reality, again, is that what we saw from Western intelligence is that the first targets of the airstrikes were not actually ISIS strongholds, but for the Free Syrian Army and the moderate rebels. But the only thing you saw in Russian media was that Russia was at the forefront of fighting terrorism. So again, there's denying the intentions and distorting the reality of their recent adventurism there. And of course, there's no mention of the atrocities by the Assad regime. So I'd say as a whole, Russian media coverage of Syria is a gross distortion. Okay. And I'm asked a lot what the goals are, what the end game is of Russian propaganda. And one of them, I think, is just to create confusion in the information space. Actually, the editor-in-chief, Margarita Simonyan, had said herself that she doesn't believe that there's such thing as an objective truth, that everything is a matter of perspective. And while that sounds good philosophically, I think journalistically that's problematic, because that means that facts can be molded to fit an agenda or an imaginary truth. So I've come to reject that. I think there is a truth. I think facts do exist. I think often they're hard to find and they're not readily apparent, but it's the job of the media to try to get to the bottom of a story, especially in wartime, and to try to uncover what that truth is. Another goal is to create division within societies and to undermine the West and NATO. An interesting thing about Russian media, I'm coming from the perspective of the U.S. Bureau, but as we know, a lot of resources have been pumped into Russian media to expand internationally, and it tends to target specific audiences and tailor the messaging to specific audiences worldwide. And lastly, which I think is one of the most dangerous, is stirring this paranoia and hatred. Another question that I'm asked a lot is why this is effective. Why is Russian propaganda effective? Why does it work? Within the United States, there is kind of this, it's kind of fashionable and in vogue to be skeptical of the establishment, and there is this lack of the media and of the government establishment. So Russian media swoops in and says, we're the alternative. We're the alternative to Western-dominated sources. We're giving you another version of the truth. And another reason why I think it's effective is that Russian media also tends to target populations that tend to be disaffected, or those that lack trust in people in power and are unhappy with the status quo. And what I saw firsthand is that Russian media also tends to target younger audiences. And then, of course, there is the social media effect, where which serves as a bullhorn, where falsehoods spread like wildfire. Something can get retweeted hundreds, thousands of times, doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but you get enough people repeating something and it becomes part of the discussion. So the takeaway from this, I would argue, in the United States where I was based, the effect of Russian media is relatively minimal because there are so many media sources. There is, however, a loyal audience that follows it and believes every word that comes out of the station. I got some mail from these viewers that would say, thank you so much. This is the only trusted alternative media source. You're providing such a service. And I'd be like, you got to check out other news sources. Keep it fair and balanced. But as we know, the Russian media, it's a priority. It's become a priority for them to get their point of view out there internationally, and they've pumped huge resources in expanding its reach worldwide. So these same tactics of denying, deflecting, distorting are applied across the board and are most effective in two situations. One, where there's a crackdown on free speech. So inside Russia, you're getting bombarded with these messages nonstop, and you're not exposed to other viewpoints. So that's one area where it's most effective. And also, it tends, as I had mentioned earlier, to target sympathetic populations, especially populations of those where there's a large population of Russian speakers, which of course has implications for the Baltic states. And the aggregate of this messaging, I would say, leads to hatred of the perceived evildoers. And in this case, it's NATO and its Western governments. And this all amounts to an ideology. And as we see with ISIS, a poisonous ideology can have devastating results. So the question remains on how to address and counter this problem of Russian propaganda. And I don't have the silver bullet answer for that. But I do think that it starts with spreading awareness on how it works and education, especially since I know that it targets young people, maybe more initiatives to educate young people that get most of their information on the internet, and to kind of take into account the way news is disseminated and consumed these days. So awareness and education, I think, are key, so that the ways in which Russia aims to shape the story and influence how you think can be minimized. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think the more education that is out there, the more that we can do to combat this and minimize the effects of Russian propaganda. And since Russian disinformation is savvy at targeting specific audience by playing into local grievances, keep a lookout on how the story is shaped through deflection, denial, and distortion. And I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Questions from the audience? Yes, I see a hand there. So let's wait for a microphone.
Hello, I'm Viktor Denisenko, and I'm journalist in information agency newsader.com. And I just want to ask you, when you worked in Russia Today, do you have some clear instructions have to will the story provide or something, because you told about some strategies to take these stories?
Right, so all those tactics that I had just mentioned, it's interesting because when you first start out there, I've worked at other news stations in the US, more conventional stations, and when you kind of you notice that the atmosphere there is different, and you kind of have to learn the ropes. And at the end of the day, you know, you want to kind of please your Russian bosses. And so you learn what's, you know, the right questions to ask, the right stories to pitch. And if you're at that morning meeting and you pitch a story that doesn't really fall in the narrative, it's just going to be an awkward silence, or you'll be told that you're not thinking out of the box and it's too mainstream or something like that. And then it takes it a step further. Those that are really willing to toe the Russian line get rewarded, and those that don't kind of get punished. You know, you can move up the ranks really quickly if you play the game. So there's that, and so you learn along the way what works, what doesn't, what to say, what not to say. So there's this high level of self-censorship that develops there. But I think that it becomes more problematic, and you see more of a strong censorship situation when it involves foreign policy. And Ukraine was a situation where there was a very uncomfortable and strong editorial control. You would talk to the news director beforehand. He would tell you explicitly what questions to ask, what not to ask, what angles we want to push. And if you didn't, your scripts would be rewritten. So when it comes to Ukraine and I would presume now Syria and those kinds of stories that involves Russia politically, then that's when you see the censorship and the more harsh tactics take root. So it's kind of a really complicated way that they keep employees in line, if that answers your question.
Elizabeth, maybe for a follow-up, I think we have some idea why the Russian journalists work for Первый Балтийский канал or for RTR inside the Moscow or St. Petersburg, but why the well-educated, intelligent American journalists come to work to Russia today? Is it some perks? Is it some better salaries, better career opportunities? Why?
Right. Well, I think it's all of that, and I think it's more. I think it's a lot more difficult to recruit Western journalists now, from what I'm hearing from former employees there, that they're having a hard time now with all the news that has come out. They probably regret hiring me. But, you know, when you first come on board, they tell you that this is an opportunity to report on stories that the mainstream media ignores. You're simply providing another perspective. And the thing that you have to remember is most of the time when we're not talking about Ukraine or these other international stories, that you're focused on domestic stories, and most of the stories are true. I would say 90, maybe 90%, 95% of what you see there is true, as long as it falls into that narrative of making the US and the West look bad. Certainly you can report on those stories that are very important and hard-hitting and have them be 100% true. And I think it gets kind of hairy when it comes to Ukraine. So they sell it as this opportunity to kind of give a voice to the voiceless and cover alternative news stories. And so it kind of seems like this really lofty, interesting organization to be a part of at first. But the longer you're there, the more I think disillusioned some reporters get. On the other hand, there are a population of reporters that strongly believe in the messaging there and strongly believe. I had mentioned one of the hosts was heavily involved in 9/11 truther activism, that strongly believe that the U.S. is this hegemonic power, and you know, and so I say it's this kind of psychological. I think there should be some kind of a psychological experiment on what happens in that newsroom, because it gets really bizarre. And then when you get into it, you know, you're following this kind of anti-mainstream, anti-establishment narrative. The stories that you read, the guests that you have on, the stories that you focus on, you're kind of in this vacuum. And some people really come to believe in the mission. And there was definitely this strong sense of anti-Americanism that developed there, which I think I was a little bit immune from. One thing that I was disgusted was that really kind of bothered me, I think, was this almost denigrating the U.S. military for the fun of it, kind of, and you know, just making it out to be evil, just like any other U.S. institution. And I agree. I strongly believe that you should call out war crimes and wrongdoing when they happen, but to denigrate institutions, and I come from a military family, so I took it personally. I think that over time, I just got very disgusted by what I saw, and especially in Ukraine. And I strongly believe that Ukraine was a pivotal point for Russian media, and I don't think it's gotten any better since.
You've been talking about educating the public. How do you suppose it can be educated when the penetration of Russia today in Europe is, I think it's already even better than CNN's, because you can get it at every hotel room in every European room.
It's in this hotel.
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't watch, but yeah. And I was saying that the effect is more so in countries with you know, Russian-speaking populations. But where I see the effect, even in the United States, is the way that the messaging is spread on the internet. And a lot of, you know, more people are turning to the internet to get their information. So let's say you wanted to find out about Ukraine and you Google it. Some of the sources that come out are from conspiracy theory websites, from RT, from Sputnik, from Russian sympathizing websites. So if you're trying to find out what's going on and you don't follow Ukraine on a daily basis, and you just kind of try to get a feel for what's going on there, and you're trying to find the information on the internet, a lot of it is skewed. So I think there needs to be more of a push to educate students, young students, especially in this new information age that's changed so rapidly. You know, gone are the days where you read, you know, the newspaper where the checks and balances were very strong. There were strong rules about sourcing, you know, or you got your evening news from the trusted anchorman or anchorwoman. The news comes out now by the hour, by the minute, by the second. And Russian media, I think, is very savvy with that and manipulating that online. So I think that there does need to be more of a push to educate young people on how to identify biased news stories and how to be more conscientious news consumers.
By whom, do you think? Because there was a deputy of Secretary of the State, John Kerry, who are talking about introducing some Russian-speaking TV channels for the Russian audience, sponsored by the United States. But they don't believe they can be at least 10% that effective of Russia Today. So who should do the education?
Well, in the U.S., I would say maybe implement it into curriculums. I know that there's some watchdog organizations that are working on spreading information on how Russian media works. I try to do my part by speaking at events and sounding the alarm on how it works. I think that reporters need to be more aware of how Russian propaganda is the ways that it functions, so that they're not duped by it. Because you see, in one way that it trickles into Western reporting, you know, there's this tendency to get both sides of the stories, which usually seems like the right thing to do. However, if you have one side that is really actively trying to search for the facts and get to the bottom of the story, but then you cite the Kremlin's narrative and they're just trying to twist the story, instead of getting a more full picture, balanced view of what the truth is, I think the truth becomes farther away and more abstracted. So I think journalists need to be more aware of how Russian media aims to manipulate the message, and also be wary of how they get their information on social media. And so I don't know. I don't have the silver bullet answer, but I think those two are important places to start.
Okay. Question, please.
Journalist and expert. I've just want to support you because I have practical experience. I lived in Czech Republic when happened this situation in Ukraine, and we trying to find how can address to Russian propaganda, because it was kind of awful situation when even state or public television of Czech Republic just repeating the Russian propaganda, and we found just one way to collect main journalists, local journalists, and trying to educate them. Because we found that they are not bad or good guys, they just don't understand the situation, because they studied about China, about the other parts of the world, but they didn't study actually deep information about, for example, relationship between Ukraine and Russia, this background, historical background, and they were under influence of this massive propaganda. So we just discussed this situation with journalists, like very informal, trying to step by step to explain the situation from Ukrainian point of view, and invited people from Ukraine, and it works. It works.
Yeah.
So maybe this is the way to trying to speak with local journalists to understand the situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Speak to local journalists, and I guess to try to be a little bit more optimistic. In the last 2 years, I think that there is more education, and I find that there are more experts and people that have been paying attention to the effects of Russian propaganda. There was I had testified in U.S. Congress a few months ago, so you see that the U.S. is really trying to find ways to counter this propaganda. So people are taking it seriously and really are becoming more aware of the implications of it, and trying to hopefully work together to come to a solution.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your time, for coming to Vilnius and sharing us. This is a small token from a... Thank you very much, Mrs. Elizabeth Wall.